Remember, we're recording, so, but just because we're recording, that doesn't mean that we can't be a little bit interactive. Today, we might actually, possibly, if I can keep from being too long-winded, we might actually finish before 11 o'clock, just given the nature of what we're dealing with here. As before, I have a written document, and I don't have copies of it, but this will be up on the website underneath the video on the YouTube channel once that gets uploaded. I do have this handout for you today, and I have that in my printed document on page 4 as well. So we'll get to that in a little bit, but that's just so you can have an easier, bigger visual of what we'll be talking about. And since it is in the printed document as well, if you, I think it looks like maybe the two of you did not get one. You can get one if you go to the website and download this, you can get one that way. Or Suzanne will share it with you. So far what we've talked about is, well, on the first day, this is our third week, right? The first week we talked about just generally what are we trying to do in this ACG. We're not trying to study everything about the Exodus. We have pretty limited time to try to address things, so we're picking and choosing our way through. And we're dealing specifically with this question of what is the biblical and non-biblical evidence that the Exodus actually historically took place. As you know, many people are convinced that the Exodus is a myth. It was made up later, it didn't actually happen. And there are a number of different kinds of reasons that people bring to that discussion or debate to make that point, either in favor or against the historicity of the Exodus. One of the things that is perennially controversial is the date of the Exodus. And the date of the Exodus, if it happened, is not just controversial between people who think the Exodus actually happened versus people who think it didn't, but it's even controversial among people who agree that, yeah, the Exodus is a historical thing. There's an early date, which is typically given around the year 1450 BC, and that relies primarily on the numbers that are presented in the Bible, saying 480 years before Solomon built the temple. That's when the Exodus occurred. For Jephthah in the book of Judges says 300 years ago we came in and we've had this land since then. That points to an early date. The late date has doesn't have those numbers in its favor, but it has other things in its favor, like the specific mention of the cities of Ramesses and Pithom, which did not exist until later, around the time of the early 13th century. That would be maybe 1280, 1270 BC. And so there's a 200-year difference between early dates and late dates, and we talked a bit about this last time. But in order for an Exodus to have happened at all, it's also important that Israel actually was in Egypt to begin with. If Israel wasn't in Egypt to begin with, then the idea of a historical Exodus makes a lot less sense. Okay, and a lot of people are convinced that the evidence for an Israelite sojourn in Egypt is just not there, and probably Israel was always in Canaan, and they made up this story to give themselves a sort of an origins myth. Or maybe just a small group of Israelites was in Egypt. Maybe it was just the Levites, and they came out and met up with the rest of the Israelites who were already in Canaan. That's another explanation that is often argued. And the question of whether the sojourn in Egypt actually happened, and to what extent, how large of a sojourn was it, how many people were there, was it the whole nation of Israel, or was it just a few people? That question really hinges on, from again, looking outside of the Bible. The Bible itself clearly states all of Israel was there. But we would like to know what archaeological and inscriptional evidence is there to support this. Okay? So what people who argue against the historicity of the Exodus on the basis of no sojourn, what they look to is the fact that there is no direct evidence of Israel's sojourn in Egypt. There's also no direct evidence of Israel's wanderings in the wilderness. And by direct evidence, I mean stones with the name Israel carved on it, or clay tablets with letters written from the king of Egypt to the king of Ugarit saying, those Israelites really messed things up here when they left a few years ago. We don't have any direct evidence like that. The earliest direct evidence that we have regarding the existence of a people called Israel, you remember from 2 weeks ago, is the Merneptah stela, which specifically names Israel as a people group. Okay, so the question arises, well, there's a couple of questions. Why don't we have direct evidence for the Israelites before the Merneptah stela?
I have a question.
Yes.
The stela, this was in hieroglyphics.
This was in hieroglyphics.
Okay, now, I don't have a good understanding of hieroglyphics, but how were they able to determine that word was actually Israel?
Uh-huh.
It was more like a picture, wasn't it, than it was an alphabet?
Yeah. So the I don't know how to read hieroglyphics myself.
Yeah.
My understanding is that hieroglyphics, some hieroglyphics are pictures for whole words. Some hieroglyphics are more like an alphabet, where it still is a picture, but it stands for a syllable or a letter. And I can't actually draw what the stela looks like, but maybe it's something like, I think there's maybe like a raven looking this way, and there's a couple of dots in a thing like that, and maybe there's some water or something. There's some sort of symbol like this. I'm going to, just for the sake of, I hasten to add, this is entirely made up. There's some sort of symbolic representation like this where people who actually know how to read hieroglyphs can look at this and say, oh yeah, let's see here. This is the symbol for Y. This is the symbol for SR. This is the symbol for I. And this is the symbol for R, or a different symbol for R.
So is this an area of controversy, or is it people pretty much agreed that Israel is spelled out in hieroglyphics there?
As far as I'm aware, this is not controversial.
Okay.
Everybody agrees that this is the hieroglyph for Israel.
Okay.
By the way, this R here, the reason it's an R instead of an L is because Egyptian is, think about Japanese. Modern Japanese language does not distinguish between L's and R's, right? So I remember one time when a group of Japanese English language learners did a skit, and they were presenting their skit in English, and they said, "This is the best English class in the world," right? There's a lot of R, L things going on there because Japanese does not distinguish those two sounds. Ancient Egyptian did not distinguish those two sounds either. So anything in Hebrew that's an L, it's written as a kind of an R in Egyptian. So there's something like this in the Merneptah stela, and it's uncontroversial that this translates into a sequence of sounds like this, which means Israel. Good question. I'm going to erase this now because it's embarrassing, because it's totally made up and probably has all sorts of things in it that would make an actual Egyptologist cringe. But we don't, the Merneptah stela is the earliest direct evidence that we have for the existence of a people called Israel. So the question is, Why don't we have direct evidence of Israel in Egypt during the time that the Bible says Israel was there? And there's a few reasons why that might be. One possibility is because they weren't there, and that sort of is the leap that people take. I do think it's a leap when they say, well, there's no evidence for Israel existing in Egypt. We've been digging around in the sands of Egypt and Sinai for a lot of years. We haven't found anything. They weren't there. On the other hand, this is an instance where I would suggest, and I'm not the only one suggesting this, that it's important to keep in mind that the absence of evidence for a thing is not the same as evidence for the absence of the thing. That's an argument from silence. Other good reasons why we have not found direct evidence, rocks with the names of Jacob and his sons carved on them in Egypt. Reasons that we haven't found direct evidence can kind of be broken down into three categories, basically. Geographical / geological reasons, political reasons, and the reasons having to do with the nature of the thing that we're looking for. With regard to that last point, the nature of the thing we're looking for, although Israelites, according to the Bible, lived in Egypt for hundreds of years, from the time of the Exodus until the conquest of Canaan, and even into the conquest of Canaan period, they were a people on the move. They lived in tents. They stored their water in animal skins instead of pottery. They did not build stone houses. And they moved around. So the fact that we when we go to Sinai, we don't find stone foundations of houses. We don't find a lot of pottery sherds that tell us, oh yeah, there were people here, and they were Israelites. We shouldn't expect to find that. We shouldn't expect to find that because of the nature of what we're dealing with. Politically, really, archaeology as a professional science has only existed for 125 years. It's not an old science, and it's only in that last 100 or so years that people have been digging, excavating in the Middle East, looking for information about any of the ancient peoples who lived there. And in that last 125 years, there has been a lot of political unrest in the area. Archaeologists have to get permission from local governments to go and dig places. If they don't, if they just go straight in and do it anyway, they can get into big, big trouble. And that sort of thing has happened, but mostly 100 years ago and more. Secondly, it's not always safe. Even if you've got permission from the local government may not have absolute control over the even more local people who may not want you there. And so there's a lot of reasons why a lot of the Sinai, in particular, has not been excavated at all. So there hasn't been a lot of excavation. We think, because we've discovered the cities of Troy and Mycenae and Thebes and all these great locations, we think that everything has been excavated and combed over, and we haven't found anything, so therefore it's not there to find. But that's actually not the case. Actually, a very small amount of the ancient Near East has been excavated. And the areas where we expect to find Israel, in the Sinai and in the eastern Nile Delta area, that's not been one of the places where there's been a lot of opportunity to look. Okay? The third reason that we have not found evidence, especially in the Nile Delta area, in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites were living for hundreds of years, we don't find direct evidence of their existence there, partly because of geography and the geology of the area. it's extremely low-lying land. Until the New Kingdom period, maybe a little earlier, I'm not entirely sure. This is again where an actual Egyptologist would have better information for you. But for a long time, the Nile Delta area was a marshy, boggy wetland. It was not suitable for large civilizations. It was only later that a lot of the swamps got drained and people started building cities in the area. Even then, it's very low elevation. The water table is very high, and a lot of these ancient cities, like Avaris, which was the capital of the Hyksos kingdom, or the city of Pi-Ramesses, which Exodus mentions as the starting location of the Exodus itself. Those cities, we know where they are. Those cities have been identified through excavations. But a lot of those cities, a lot of what we would want to look for is below the water table. So it's hard to excavate because as soon as you dig, your hole starts filling in with water. It's also not necessarily the best environment to preserve materials from 3,000, 3,500 years ago. Okay, most of what we know about Egyptian archaeology comes from further south in the dry desert, sandy area. It's not coming from the Nile Delta region. So there's a lot of stuff going on. Okay, true to self, I am being extremely long-winded, and we haven't even started the handout yet. Yeah.
I think of another reason is because the Egyptians were so defeated with the water and everything, they don't usually record things of their defeat, so they did not record this whole thing.
That's absolutely correct. We would frankly be surprised if the Egyptians would have inscribed or painted a wall in their temple saying, the Israelites beat us, woohoo. You know, that wouldn't have happened. And in fact, the Egyptians, when they conquer somebody, being conquered or defeated in battle is such a dishonorable or disgraceful thing. They, in the New Kingdom period specifically, they don't even give the defeated person, the defeated king, the dignity of having a name. It's just the king of so-and-so we defeated. They don't name who it is. And that's there's some thought that perhaps the reason why the Pentateuch never names the Pharaoh is because of that kind of a polemic. This is a battle between Pharaoh and God. God wins, and we're not going, just like the Pharaoh is not dignifying other defeated peoples with names, Pharaoh is not going to be dignified with a name. That's one of the thoughts about why the Exodus does not name who the Pharaoh is. We would kind of like to know who the Pharaoh was, but that's not there. Okay, so direct evidence, we don't have any. Lots of potential reasons why. But there's also indirect evidence. And of indirect evidence for the possibility, if not the likelihood, of an Israelite sojourn in Egypt, there's lots of indirect evidence for that. Okay, and that's really what we're going to talk about for the next half hour today. The indirect evidence comes in a couple of different forms. First of all, it is well established, it is not controversial among Egyptologists, that there were lots of periods of time in ancient Egyptian history when there were lots of Semitic people in Egypt, especially in the eastern Nile Delta area, which is the land of Goshen, where the Bible says the Israelites were. Let me write down a couple things here. Just for a broad chronological timeline, Egyptian history is often divided up into the Old Kingdom. There's also earlier stuff before the Old Kingdom, but we're just going to start with the Old Kingdom. And then there's the first intermediate period. when the old kingdom sort of faltered and the pharaohs lost widespread power, and there was a lot of regional conflict, and nobody was really in charge. And then finally somebody got control of things again, and you had the Middle Kingdom. And then you have the second intermediate kingdom period. The second intermediate period is when the Hyksos were ruling in Egypt. The Hyksos were specifically a Semitic people from the Canaan, Syria area. And they came in and they took over. And then you have the New Kingdom. Eventually the Egyptians expelled the Hyksos from Egypt, and we have the New Kingdom. The Old Kingdom, roughly from 2686 BC, that sounds very precise, to 2181 BC. That also sounds very precise. Probably sounds more precise than it really is. The first intermediate period is from 2181 to 2055, or thereabouts. The Middle Kingdom, 2055 to 1710, 1710 to 1550, and 1550 to 1077. Those are at least rough dates for you, okay?
I have a question.
Yes.
The term Semitic people, how do you define that?
What does that mean?
Yeah.
Yes, so the term Semitic people, and this is actually in here. The term Semitic people today usually is synonymous with Jewish people, right? And so we talk about anti-Semitism means anti-Jew. Back in the day, Semitic was a larger group of people who were, going back to the biblical narrative, the descendants of Shem, the son of Noah. So, and the Israelites are a later, individual branch of that family. Today, from a scholarly point of view, Semitic refers to the kind of language that was spoken. So there are a number of Semitic languages that we have inscriptions for, we have documents for. The Bible is written in Hebrew, the Old Testament is written in Hebrew, that's a Semitic language. The Assyrians spoke a Semitic language and wrote in a Semitic language. The Moabites and the Ammonites and the Edomites all spoke and wrote in Semitic languages that are all more or less closely related to each other. And that is generally what is the criterion for saying this group of people was a Semitic people. They spoke a Semitic language, and on top of that, they're from east of Egypt in Canaan, Syria, Mesopotamia. Yes?
Would the Arabic people also be Semitic?
Arabic is a Semitic language as well, yes. Yes. Okay, so does that answer the question? Yeah? Okay. So there were Semitic language speaking people, also for short, called Semites, living in Egypt.
Would that include the area where Abraham came from with the start of Babylon and
Yes.
all that?
Yes, it would. Yes, it would. Yeah. It would not include the Hittites. The Hittites spoke an Indo-European language, but most of the rest of and the Philistines. The Philistines spoke an Indo-European language, but the rest of Canaan and that area in Mesopotamia, that was Semitic speaking. So the second intermediate period is when the Hyksos, that means the shepherd kings, they were ruling in Egypt during this time. This is very attractive for thinking about the time that Joseph arrived in Egypt. It's attractive to be able to say, well, If Joseph arrived in Egypt around the beginning of this time, when the Hyksos rulers were coming into power, it would make sense that he, as a Semite, could become the number 2 person in the kingdom, and that as a result of his policies storing up grain and then selling grain, the Genesis tells us that all Egypt became subject to the Pharaoh at that time. And that fits well with the idea of the Hyksos sort of consolidating their power throughout the land of Egypt. That's some conjecture. We don't have direct evidence of that, but it fits nicely. And so we know that there were lots of Semites in Egypt, especially in the Delta area, at this time in the intermediate period. We know about it from earlier periods as well. There's a couple of inscriptions from the first intermediate period and the beginning of the Middle Kingdom period, which talk about those foreigners, Semites from Asia, who are now invading and living in the Delta region. There's one text called Instructions for Merikari. Merikari was the son of the Pharaoh, and ostensibly these instructions are written to him by his father, the Pharaoh. And among other things, he says, now speaking about these foreigners, as for the miserable Asiatic, wretched is the place where he is, lacking in water, hidden because of trees, many and difficult are the paths therein, because of mountains. He has not settled in one place. Food causes his feet to roam about. He fights since the time of Horus. Horus would be one of the Egyptian gods. He does not conquer, nor is he conquered. He does not declare war, but is like a thief darting about in a group. But as I live and will be what I am, these foreigners were indeed a sealed wall. Its gates were opened when I besieged it. I caused the Delta to attack it. I plundered their inhabitants, having captured their cattle. I slaughtered the people among them, so that the Asiatics abhorred Egypt. So don't be anxious about him. Okay? This is a king of the of the early Middle Kingdom period, or the late First Intermediate period, talking about the problems that Egypt had with Semites from Asia in the Delta area. There's also from sometime in the 1900s BC, so again Middle Kingdom area, there's a text called the Prophecy of Neferti, who says, Asiatics travel with their swords, terrorizing those who are harvesting, seizing the oxen from the plow. All happiness has gone away. The land is cast down in trouble because of those feeders, Asiatics, who are throughout the land. Enemies have arisen in the east. Asiatics have come down to Egypt. Yes?
Abraham went to Egypt. What time period would that fit in?
When Abraham went to Egypt back and forth, that was probably in the Middle Kingdom. That depends on whether you accept an early or a late date for the Exodus. Exactly when Abraham would have been coming. But when Abraham is coming, however you date it, it was known. The Egyptians had their minds on these Asiatics, these Semites coming from the east and coming to the Delta area. So the idea that there would be Semitic people in Egypt is not controversial. Semitic people were in Egypt all the time. They were there permanently as the rulers here in the Second Intermediate period. And we know that they were there in the New Kingdom as well. For instance, the tomb of Rekhmire, I don't know if that's pronounced correctly, but I'm going with it. He was the vizier to Pharaoh Thutmose III. Thutmose III was an early-ish New Kingdom pharaoh. Okay, the tomb of his vizier has a painting or a relief or something on the wall which depicts Semitic laborers making bricks and constructing buildings. There's a text that goes with it, an inscribed text that goes with the picture that talks about this is what's going on. Some of these laborers were prisoners of war from the region of Syria and Canaan, down in the Middle Kingdom period when we expect the Israelites to be enslaved. There's a papyrus manuscript that has been discovered. It dates from the 1200s, from the reign of Ramesses II, who, according to the late date of the Exodus, Ramesses II would have been the pharaoh of the Exodus. There's a papyrus that we have from his reign, referring to Semites dragging stone to the great pylon. You know, it makes me think of the movie, The Ten Commandments, and Moses is, before he's figured out that he's a Hebrew, he's overseeing the construction of the great city of Ramesses, and he's erecting this huge pylon in honor of Seti. Again, that's just a movie. It's not. It doesn't count as direct evidence for anything. But that's what this makes me think of. So the conditions for an Israelite sojourn in Egypt, including enslavement in the Delta area, including making bricks. I've even read somewhere, although I was not able to relocate it, but apparently there's even some inscription that states that these Semitic laborers were making bricks without straw, and they were building the Pharaoh's construction projects. The conditions for all that are known and uncontroversial in the New Kingdom period, when the sojourn and the slavery would have actually been happening according to the Bible. Again, none of it says these guys are Israelites. So it's indirect evidence. It's supportive evidence that this kind of thing did happen. And it very well could be that the Israelites are telling the truth when they're writing their history in the Pentateuch. That is from that's true whether you believe the Bible or not. That these conditions are uncontroversial. We know that they were happening. Now there's more stuff. Let me pause for a second and see if there are any other questions. Thank you, and you, for interrupting when you had a question. Any other thoughts or questions? Okay. Well, of course, feel free to interrupt if you'd like. There's other indirect evidence, and this has to do more with what's in the Bible itself. Okay? So this is, in some ways, this is even more fun. Here's the idea. If Israel actually lived in Egypt for hundreds of years prior to the Exodus, you might expect certain Egyptian cultural influences on Israelite culture to be apparent. Okay? And as it turns out, that is the case. Not only that, but these Egyptian cultural influences tend to die out not long after the Exodus period. For example, names. Moses. Moses is an Egyptian name. It's the same name in the names of a lot of pharaohs. Tutmos, Tutmoses. There was Tutmos the first, the second, the third, and the fourth. 4 pharaohs named Tutmos. The Mose, M-O-S-E, that's the same word as Moses. Amos, Pharaoh Amos. There's, I think, a couple of those. I think there's a Pharaoh Kamos. There's at least three pharaohs named Ramos. That's Ramesses. It's all the same word as the name Moses. And what it means is it's something to do with being born or being the son of So Ramesses means born of Ra, the son of Ra, the god Ra. Tutmos, the son of the god Tut. Okay, so that's a common name in Egypt, and particularly among the ruling classes in Egypt. And here is Moses, who has exactly that name. Now, on a side note, I find it interesting that all the Egyptian pharaohs are son of some Egyptian god, whereas Moses is just son of, or born, or something like that. And I wonder if that's not kind of on purpose. Again, thinking about the Exodus as a battle between God and God's son Israel, represented by Moses, versus the Egyptian gods and their representative, their son, the Pharaoh. And so the Pharaoh is specifically named for his God, and Moses is not specifically, he's not named Yahweh Mos, or something like that. But it makes me wonder if it kind of goes in that direction, as a point that Moses is a representative of the God, not some Egyptian God. So Moses is an Egyptian name. Moses had a sister. What was her name? Miriam. Miriam is an Egyptian name. It probably is from a root that means beloved. And that's where we get the name Mary today. The name Mary is an ancient Egyptian name. By the way, the name Susan, or Suzanne, or Susanna is also an ancient Egyptian name. And there's a masculine version of the name, Sheshan, which is the name of an Israelite in the Bible. And that comes from Egypt. Phineas. Phineas was the grandson of Aaron, the high priest. Phineas is an Egyptian name. And those three names and a few others are uncontroversially Egyptian names. There are even more that are probably Egyptian names, or maybe possibly Egyptian names. But there is some controversy sometimes. For instance, the name of Moses' brother, Aaron, is very possibly an Egyptian name. Some other folks include, well, so far all of the names that I've given you are Levites. Moses, Aaron, Miriam, Phineas, they're all Levites. This has caused some people to suggest that it was really only the Levites who were in Egypt. And they were the ones who came out, and that's why they're the leaders, Moses and Aaron and Miriam. And that they joined up with the rest of the Israelites once they got to Canaan. That is actually, I find that is stated a lot if you do a search for, like on Google, for what people think about these things. But as a matter of fact, there are a number of other names that are not Levite names that probably are Egyptian, including the names of people from the tribes of Naphtali and Simeon and Judah. Also, one of the midwives, remember before the Exodus actually happened, the people were multiplying. The Pharaoh said, this isn't good, we've got to put a stop to this. So there were 2 Israelite midwives, and he called them in and said, when the Israelite women give birth, see if it's a boy, if it is, kill him, right? Toss him in the river. The name of one of these midwives is Puah, and that is an uncontroversially Egyptian name. We don't know what tribe she was from, but we have these Egyptian names. So here's a quick summary about this. While Egyptian personal names are somewhat abundant in connection with the Exodus and wilderness traditions, those narratives, there's at least 15 examples of people named with Egyptian names. That becomes much less common after the Exodus. In the rest of the Bible, after the Pentateuch, in the rest of the Bible, there's maybe 3 examples There's Hophni and Phinehas, the sons of Eli, at the beginning of 1 Samuel, which is pretty early, not that far removed from the Exodus. And then there's a priest named Pashur. This is again all Levites, interestingly. There's a priest named Pashur who in Jerusalem, he's the priest who arrested Jeremiah the prophet. So that's quite a bit later. And that's an Egyptian name. As far as I'm aware, that's it. You got a whole bunch of Egyptian names in the time period right after the sojourn is supposed to have happened, and you've got hardly anything in the next 1,000 years of history. Yes?
What about the prophet Amos? You said that was an Egyptian name?
Oh, I'm sorry. The Pharaoh Amos, which is spelled Ahmose, that's different.
Okay.
That's the same word as Moses. Amos is a different word altogether. I can't tell you what that word is, but it's a different word altogether.
Was there any cultural rub-off in the other direction?
Oh, that's a good question. Yes, there was some cultural rub-off in the other direction. There are Semitic words that show up as Egyptian loanwords in Egyptian. Some names that are Semitic in origin that show up in Egyptian names. I did not specifically prepare to talk about that, though, so I can't give you any examples. But I do recall, I have read about that. Yes,
Okay.
it does go both ways.
I didn't know, since they were such a small group compared to the Egyptian society, whether there would be a rub-off in the other direction or not.
Yes, and the rub-off in the other direction is not necessarily coming from Israel. It's coming from the long history of Semites in Egypt.
Semites.
Yeah, and especially in this intermediate period when the Hyksos were ruling. Yeah. There's more indirect evidence of Egyptian cultural influence in the Exodus and wilderness narratives. And I'm going to specifically talk about the tabernacle and the equipment that are attached to the tabernacle. And there's just a couple of things that I want to say about this. The tabernacle, you know what the tabernacle looked like? It was a rectangle. There was an outer wall, an outer perimeter, and then inside that perimeter you had a smaller tent, which was a rectangle. Okay, you enter at one end, and then you enter into into this rectangle, and there's another square section in the very back. That's the Holy of Holies. So you have the area of the tabernacle, the outer court, and then you have the holy place, which is inside the smaller rectangle. And then at the back of the holy place, you have the Holy of Holies, which is square. Look at that handout now. And you will see, if you look at the side that's in color, you will see a rectangular box clearly demarcated there. And that large dark rectangle is equivalent to the outer court. And then inside that, there's a very lightly drawn smaller rectangle with a dark base. And there are people on top of that dark base, and then there's some interesting thing on the right-hand side there, right? But that is that smaller rectangle is the holy place. It's equivalent to the holy place. And then inside that holy place at the back, there's a square space, which is the equivalent of the Holy of Holies. There's even two falcons with their wings outstretched, and a cartouche, a representation of either the Pharaoh or the god in between those two falcons. This is the equivalent to the Ark of the Covenant, which was the footstool of God. God lived above the cherubim in the biblical language. And the cherubim had these wings that were outstretched toward each other, and the presence of God is between them. That cartouche, this is an Egyptian tabernacle. It's an Egyptian tabernacle. It's actually the palace, the portable moving palace of Ramesses II is what you're looking at here. God had a portable moving sanctuary. God was the king for Israel as well as the God. And so he had this palace temple that was portable, movable, and he dwelled in it, and the people of Israel took it with them all the way into Canaan. And Pharaoh Ramesses II had his own portable palace/temple. Remember, Pharaoh is not only the ruler of Egypt, he's also kind of the god of Egypt. He's the son of Ra, Ramesses is. And so he had his own Holy of Holies inside of a larger tent-like structure where people could come and serve him. You see these people, these particular people are prisoners of war who are kneeling and offering allegiance to him. The image on the other side of your paper, the one that's in black and white, is the same thing, but from a different site in Egypt. And again, you see a large rectangle with a smaller rectangle inside of it, which has a square in the back. That is Ramesses II's portable palace as he went off to war. This was from his campaign against the Hittites at the Battle of Kadesh, north of Israel. There's a lot of interesting similarities between Ramesses' war tent, as this is often called, and the Israelite tabernacle. Those similarities, Pharaoh was not the only one who had a portable war tent in the ancient Near East. But it doesn't take you very long after the Exodus before you start finding that the style and the design of these war tents changes to a more circular or oval shape instead of a rectangular shape. So the kings of Assyria, for instance, had circular or oval-shaped war tents. So this is another piece of information, another piece of indirect evidence that maybe the design of the tabernacle is reflecting common cultural norms of that time in Egypt. And again, that it's polemical. God is saying, Pharaoh, you think you're all it. Well, you've got a portable tent. It's nice, but this is the real tabernacle. And it's the real tabernacle because I, God, am actually there. So there could be a polemical statement there. Again, in the battle between Pharaoh and God. There's more, and I'll just sort of list these off. This is a subset of examples that I mentioned in the first week. There's these books by James Hoffmeyer, Israel in Egypt, Ancient Israel in Sinai. They're really good books, and I'm taking a lot of this stuff from those books specifically. And a subset of some of the stuff that he talks about includes when the tabernacle was built, it was made, the framework of it was made with acacia wood. And the word for acacia, for the acacia tree, in the Bible, is an Egyptian loanword. It's not written in hieroglyphics, but it's a borrowing that's been rewritten into the Hebrew, using Hebrew letters. It's an Egyptian word. The Ark of the Covenant was made of acacia wood, overlaid with gold. The lid, the mercy seat with the cherubim on it, that was made of beaten gold. The altar of incense was acacia wood overlaid with gold. The table of showbread was acacia wood overlaid with gold. The lampstand was pure beaten gold. The overlaying of gold on these wooden objects is described in a way that sounds very similar to techniques that were employed in Egypt. And the word used for this gold is an Egyptian word. The lampstand has a number of cups that are described as looking like almond leaves or almond blossoms. a number of these cups that hold oil all around the different branches. The lampstand is a tree. It's a pure gold, beaten gold depiction of a tree. And it has these cups that hold oil, and that's the oil that gets burned to create the light. The word for cups in the Bible is an Egyptian word. The linen that was used to hang curtains around the tabernacle, and also it was used for the priest's clothing, that's an Egyptian word. Later on, even when Chronicles is quoting Exodus, a different word is used for the linen, and it's a non-Egyptian word. This is an Egyptian word that's used in the Exodus narratives. The priests wore a sash or a belt. The word for that sash is an Egyptian word. Words that are used to describe various bowls of incense or censers or fire pans, some of these are Egyptian words. Most of these are uncontroversially Egyptian. I missed one. 3 of the gemstones that adorned the breastplate that the high priest would wear. There were 12 gemstones, one for each of the tribes of Israel. 3 of them are named with Egyptian names. And then there's other stuff as well that if you want to get into that level of detail, James Hoffmeier's books are really good. So what is the point of all of this? Let me see here. I think I led with the point that there's not really any direct evidence that we have found yet for the sojourn in Egypt. That could mean that the sojourn didn't happen, in which case the Exodus could not have happened. But there are other possibilities as well, and these other possibilities are really quite plausible when you think about it. The conditions for the Exodus are known at that time. And then all these indirect references to Egyptian culture in the names of people and in the words used for different parts of the tabernacle, all of that, those names and those words get replaced by purely Semitic words later on. So it's just right here in the generation that left Egypt, right where you would expect it to be. So there's that indirect evidence suggesting that the Exodus actually could have happened.
The design of the tabernacle,
Yes.
I can see where somebody could say, well, that was not, that did not come from God, they just copied it from the Egyptians.
Yes, and people have said that.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. I rather think that God uses material culture of the people that he's trying to speak to tell them something. We're used to, if we're ancient Egyptians, we know what a royal portable palace or temple is supposed to look like. God tells the Israelites, build it like that, and the point is not lost on the Egyptians, or something like that. That's kind of how I think about it. Yeah.
Did the Egyptians have any form of a sacrificial system like the Israel's instituted after Sinai?
I believe so, but I don't know anything about it.
Okay.
Yeah. There's another example of this sort of, I guess today we would call it cultural appropriation. One of the Psalms is a psalm to God, but it's a psalm of praise to God. But we know, I don't know how we know this, but it seems to me that it's uncontroversial, that it is a reworking of an already existing psalm of praise to the god Baal. And it's taking this hymn to Baal and recasting it as a hymn to God, saying, no, praise does not belong to Baal, praise belongs to God. So I think that sort of thing did happen in a polemical sense. And yes, some people will say, oh, the Israelites were just copying, and it didn't have anything to do with God. People will say that. But I think that we can also answer back and say, well, it's not quite that simple. Next time, next time, so if Israel actually did live in Egypt for hundreds of years, and if it did actually multiply like the Bible says it did, then we might ask, well, exactly how many people were there and how many people were involved? And this becomes a technical point that a lot of people today point to say, there's no way the Exodus account can actually be historically accurate. So we're going to talk about that next time. How many people were actually involved? All right? Suzanne?
Yeah, I know that Jesus referred to this when Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness. Was there any other direct reference by Jesus to the Exodus?
Other than, I mean, he mentions Moses a lot.
Yes.
And-
He said, as Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness, so shall the Son of Man be lifted up.
Yeah.
Which to me is proof that Moses was, they were in the wilderness.
Right. And the event did happen. Yeah. I'm not sure offhand. I mean, obviously there's a lot of references to Moses and the law and the Exodus. But something like that, I'd have to think about that more.
Wouldn't there be, since Jesus followed the law, and would, if Moses hadn't existed, he wouldn't have done that. So,
You would sure think so. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I completely agree with that. I'm there are even a lot of Christians and even a lot of evangelicals who question whether the Exodus and Moses and all that really has to be historical, and whether that's important for our faith. I am not one of them. I'm convinced Moses existed. Moses wrote the Pentateuch. Maybe somebody touched it up a little bit at some later time, but that's kind of where I am. So I completely agree with that thought.
Well, Suzanne, when Jesus and Moses and Elijah met
Yeah.
on the mountain.
Yeah.
So that's where he actually.
Yeah. Moses actually shows up in person. Right. Yeah. All right. It is 5 minutes after again. I sure to self, I got long-winded. So sorry about that. If anybody wants to stick around, I'm happy to stick around as well.